A surveillance camera had captured the people Philadelphia police wanted to identify, but it could not give detectives their names. That changed when the footage reached the internet. Within hours, strangers online connected the images to an ordinary group photograph taken inside a restaurant, identified where that photograph had been taken, searched social media information associated with the location, and began putting names to faces. The investigation that followed became an early and unusually clear example of how publicly available information on social media could transform unidentified people in surveillance footage into concrete leads for police. At approximately 10:45 on the night of September 11, 2014, Zachary Hess, 28, and his partner Andrew Haught, 27, were walking through Center City, Philadelphia. Hesse later testified that they had left a frozen yogurt shop and were heading to get pizza when they encountered a group near 16th and Chancellor Streets. The group consisted of roughly a dozen young adults who had been out in Center City celebrating a birthday. According to Hesse's later testimony and the prosecution's evidence, the encounter began with an anti-gay remark directed toward the couple. Words were exchanged. The confrontation escalated into pushing and punching, and members of the larger group surrounded the two men. Both Hess and Haught were injured. Hesse suffered injuries around his face and eye, while Haught was much more seriously hurt. Evidence later presented in court showed that Philip Williams repeatedly struck Haught, leaving him bleeding and initially unconscious on the ground. Haught suffered a broken jaw and another fracture around his eye. He spent 5 days in the hospital, and his jaw remained wired shut for approximately 8 weeks while the fracture healed. Hesse later testified that during the confrontation, he was surrounded and struck repeatedly as he tried to push people away from him. The group left the area after the encounter, while police began trying to determine exactly who had been involved. Investigators obtained surveillance recordings from the surrounding area. The footage did not show the assault itself in sufficient detail to establish everything that had occurred, but it provided something immediately useful: images of a group believed to be connected to the confrontation walking through Center City. On September 16th, Philadelphia police publicly released surveillance video showing approximately a dozen young men and women. Police described them at the time as young, well-dressed, and apparently in their early 20s, and asked the public for help identifying them. The footage gave investigators recognizable faces, clothing, and a group composition, but the people shown were still unidentified. Once the video was released online, however, the investigation moved beyond conventional police work. People began sharing the surveillance images across social media, particularly Twitter. Among those following the case was Greg Bennett, who circulated a separate photograph showing a group of young adults gathered at a restaurant. Several people in that photograph appeared similar to individuals visible in the police surveillance footage. The restaurant photograph contained far more information than a simple collection of faces. It placed the group together in a specific social setting, and identifying that setting could provide a path toward identifying the people themselves. An anonymous Twitter user operating under the handle @fansince09 began examining the photograph. Instead of trying to identify every face directly, he focused on establishing where the picture had been taken. Other Twitter users familiar with Philadelphia helped identify the restaurant as La Viola. That single piece of information sharply narrowed the search. The question was no longer simply who the people in an unknown photograph were. There was now a specific establishment that could be connected to social media activity associated with the group. @fansince09 then turned to Facebook's graph search, a feature available at the time that allowed users to search relationships between people, places, photographs, and other information shared on the platform. He searched for people who had recently checked in at the restaurant and followed the resulting social connections and photographs. By comparing information found through Facebook with the restaurant photograph and the surveillance images released by police, he announced on Twitter that he was confident he had identified at least 3 individuals. The process had unfolded within hours of the restaurant photograph circulating online. It required no access to confidential police databases. The crucial connections were assembled from photographs, location information, and social relationships that users had made accessible through social media. The information did not constitute proof that any identified person had committed a crime, It provided leads that investigators could examine. Philadelphia police received the names and continued their own investigation, interviewing people associated with the group and witnesses to the confrontation. Detective Joseph Murray of the Philadelphia Police Department publicly acknowledged the assistance generated through social media, while making clear that police still had investigative work to complete. The online search had helped answer the identification problem, but determining individual criminal responsibility required witness statements, interviews, and evidence that could support charges in court. As detectives reconstructed the confrontation, they interviewed 7 members of the group and 4 additional witnesses. Investigators also corrected part of the initial account concerning property belonging to one of the victims. Police had originally reported that a bag containing a wallet and credit cards had been taken during the attack. Investigators later determined that an independent witness had picked up the dropped bag, mistakenly believing it belonged to someone in the departing group, and subsequently left it at a bus stop. The later use of one of the victim's credit cards was therefore separated from the assault investigation, rather than attributed to the defendants ultimately charged. By September 22nd, Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey said investigators believed they had sufficient evidence for charges against some of the people involved, and the case was forwarded to the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. The following day, prosecutors approved charges against 3 Bucks County residents: Philip Williams, 24, Kevin Harrigan, 26, and Catherine Knott, 24. Each faced 2 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of simple assault, 2 counts of recklessly endangering another person, and criminal conspiracy. All 3 surrendered to police with their attorneys on September 24. Although the case was widely described as a gay-bashing or hate crime case, Pennsylvania law created an important distinction between that description and the charges prosecutors could actually file. At the time of the attack, the state's ethnic intimidation statute did not extend hate crime protection to offenses motivated by a victim's sexual orientation. Authorities therefore could not prosecute the 3 defendants under Pennsylvania's hate crime statute on that basis, despite evidence and testimony concerning anti-gay language during the confrontation. The case contributed to renewed pressure for changes in local law, and the Philadelphia City Council subsequently approved legislation covering crimes motivated by sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. The criminal cases eventually followed different paths. In October 2015, Williams pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and conspiracy, while Harrigan pleaded guilty to simple assault and conspiracy. Williams received 5 years of probation, and Harrigan received 3 years. Both were ordered to perform community service and were prohibited from entering Center City during their probation. Catherine Knott rejected a plea agreement and proceeded to trial, requiring a jury to determine which parts of the prosecution's allegations against her had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. During Knott's trial, jurors heard testimony about the confrontation and the actions attributed to individual members of the group. Evidence established that Harrigan had insulted the couple and became physically involved with Hess, while Williams was responsible for the serious injuries suffered by Haught. Testimony also placed Knott in the confrontation with Hess. After deliberations in December 2015, the jury reached a mixed verdict. Knott was convicted of simple assault against Hesse, conspiracy to commit simple assault, and 2 counts of reckless endangerment. She was acquitted of the felony aggravated assault charges, and was also acquitted of simple assault against Haught and conspiracy charges connected to the assault on him. In February 2016, Philadelphia Common Pleas Court Judge Roxanne Covington sentenced Knott to 5 to 10 months in jail, followed by 2 years of probation and a fine. She began serving the sentence immediately and was paroled in July after approximately 5 months in custody. The convictions, guilty pleas, and sentencing decisions were therefore based on evidence developed and tested through the criminal justice process, not on the identifications made by people online. The Internet's documented role came much earlier, at the point when investigators needed to determine who appeared in the surveillance footage. Police had released images of an unidentified group. Social media users connected those images to a restaurant photograph. Other users identified the restaurant. Facebook's location and social information provided another layer of searchable connections, and names generated through that process were passed to law enforcement for investigation. Detectives then conducted interviews, examined witness accounts, and submitted the evidence to prosecutors, who ultimately charged only 3 members of the larger group. What began with anonymous faces walking through a surveillance recording had become, through a combination of public participation and conventional police investigation, a case against specific individuals. On June 26, 1995, a Volkswagen van left U.S. Route 58 near Emporia, Virginia, and struck trees. Both young men inside were killed. The driver was identified as 21-year-old Michael Hager, but authorities could not determine who his passenger was. The passenger carried no identification. His injuries made visual identification difficult, and Hager's family did not know him. Investigators were left with the belongings recovered with the young man and a small number of clues pointing to where he had recently been. The unidentified passenger had long, wavy or curly hair that had been dyed reddish and was wearing a tie-dyed Grateful Dead shirt. 2 tickets connected him to the band's concerts at Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium in Washington, D.C. on June 24 and June 25. Other items reported with him included 4 quarters and a lighter. Most important was a handwritten note addressed to someone named Jason and signed by 2 people named Caroline. It provided a possible first name but no surname. The available clues failed to produce an identification, and because of the concert material found with him, the unknown passenger became widely known as Grateful Doe. At the same time, a real Jason had disappeared from his family's life without being connected to the Virginia case. Jason Patrick Callahan was from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and was a Grateful Dead fan. In early June 1995, he left home intending to follow the band's summer tour. His mother, Margaretta Evans, later explained that she did not know precisely where he had gone or where he might have disappeared. No missing person report was filed at the time. That absence became critical. When authorities attempted to identify the passenger in Virginia, there was no missing person record for Jason Callahan available to create the obvious comparison. Years passed with the 2 sides remaining separate. Virginia had an unidentified crash victim associated with the Grateful Dead and possibly named Jason, while Jason's family had lost contact with a young man who had left to follow the same band. The unidentified man's case eventually entered NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Because his crash injuries complicated visual identification, reconstructions were used to show what he might have looked like. A new computer reconstruction, produced in 2012, provided another image for public circulation, but no identification followed. People outside law enforcement had also begun examining the case. Web Sleuth's users had been comparing Grateful Doe with missing person cases since July 2005. The major expansion came in December 2014, when an Australian internet user known as Grey Metal created a subreddit devoted to Grateful Doe and circulated his image and case information through Imgur. Volunteers spread the material through Grateful Dead communities and other online spaces. According to the Washington Post, the image was seen more than 500,000 times. That exposure produced a lead the case had lacked for nearly 2 decades. In early January 2015, men who had known a young man named Jason came forward after seeing the material online. One former roommate said he had lived with Jason in Illinois in late 1994 and early 1995. The man he remembered was young, strongly interested in the Grateful Dead, and associated with Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Photographs of that Jason were obtained and circulated among those working on the case. The case now had a specific possible identity tied to a specific city. Volunteers on Reddit, Facebook, and Web Sleuths contacted newspapers and television stations in South Carolina, hoping the new lead would reach someone who recognized him. Local coverage followed. On January 13, 2015, Margaretta Evans encountered the Grateful Doe material and recognized the young man being discussed as potentially her son. On the Facebook page devoted to the case, she identified him as Jason Callahan of Myrtle Beach and explained that she had been looking for him for years. The response supplied the connection that had been missing between Jason's family in South Carolina and the unidentified body in Virginia. A family's recognition on Facebook could not establish a forensic identification. Evans filed a missing person report for Jason the following day, nearly 20 years later, and Myrtle Beach police opened an investigation while assisting Virginia authorities. DNA from Jason's family could then be compared with the unidentified remains. For the following months, Jason remained a possible identity rather than a confirmed match. The confirmation arrived in December 2015. The Virginia Medical Examiner's Office and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System confirmed that Grateful Doe was Jason Patrick Callahan, with DNA evidence establishing the identification. Jason had been 19 years old when he died near Emporia on June 26, 1995. The original evidence had pointed toward his life without being sufficient to identify him. The note addressed to Jason contained his actual first name. The Grateful Dead clothing and concert tickets reflected his connection to the band, while his family's account that he had left home to follow the tour was consistent with those possessions. None of those details, however, had supplied the surname needed to connect the body to the Callahan family. The Internet's role in the identification was specific. Online users did not provide the DNA evidence that formally established Jason's identity. Instead, the circulation of Grateful Doe's reconstructed appearance reached people who had personally known him. Former acquaintances supplied the Jason and Myrtle Beach lead and provided photographs. Online volunteers spread that information through social media and encouraged coverage in South Carolina. Jason's family then recognized him. Once authorities had a named missing person and biological relatives to compare with the unidentified remains, DNA could test the proposed identification. For roughly 20 years, the passenger killed beside Michael Hager existed in official records as an unidentified person, while Jason Callahan was absent from the missing person records that could have linked the two cases. Investigators had evidence describing the unknown man, connecting him to the Grateful Dead, and suggesting that his first name might be Jason, but those facts could not determine which Jason he was. The online campaign eventually bridged that information gap, while the final determination remained a forensic one. On December 9, 2015, the identification was announced, establishing that the young man, long known as Grateful Doe, was Jason Patrick Callahan of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. On the morning of August 9, 2018, 66-year-old Susan Rainwater was riding her bicycle along State Route 7 near Eatonville, Washington. She was traveling north on the shoulder of the highway as she approached 320th Street East. Washington State Patrol investigators later narrowed the collision to a period between 9:21 and 9:24 that morning. During those few minutes, a vehicle traveling in the same direction left the roadway, entered the shoulder, and struck Rainwater from behind. The driver did not remain at the scene. Rainwater was left beside the highway, while the vehicle continued north without being identified. The crash was not immediately reported as it happened. Later that morning, a passerby noticed Rainwater's damaged bicycle near the roadway and discovered her in a ditch. She had died at the scene. Investigators from the Washington State Patrol now faced a fatal hit-and-run in which the vehicle itself was gone, and there was no eyewitness identification that could immediately point them toward its driver. The roadway, however, contained something the vehicle had left behind. Detectives recovered fragments that appeared to have broken away from the front headlight assembly of a dark-colored vehicle. Although the pieces were small, their shape and construction offered a possible way to determine what kind of vehicle had struck Rainwater. Photographs of the recovered parts were released as investigators sought information from the public. One of the images posted online attracted attention far beyond Pierce County and eventually generated more than 600 comments on Reddit from automobile enthusiasts and mechanics around the United States. Instead of trying to identify a person from the evidence, users concentrated on identifying the object itself. Among the responses was one from a commenter who described himself as a Maryland State Vehicle Inspector. Based on the design of the fragment, he narrowed the component to the headlamp bezel of a Chevrolet pickup manufactured during the mid-1980s. What had initially been an unidentified piece of material from the crash could therefore be associated with a much narrower category of vehicles. The online identification was important, but it was not the only development occurring in the investigation, nor did Reddit independently identify Rainwater's driver. At approximately 8 o'clock on the morning of August 10th, the day after the collision, The Pierce County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous tip. The caller supplied a vehicle license plate and described a pickup truck with front-end damage around the right side headlight assembly. Washington State Patrol obtained that information and began following the lead. The description was significant because investigators had already recovered fragments believed to have come from the headlight area of the vehicle involved in the collision, while the online examination of those fragments had pointed toward a Chevrolet pickup from the mid-1980s. The license plate and vehicle information ultimately led investigators to 37-year-old Jeremy Simon of Roy, Washington. Simon was known to drive a Chevrolet K10 pickup manufactured in 1986 and registered to his father. That model and year were consistent with the type of vehicle suggested by the examination of the debris. The truck also provided investigators with a vehicle that could be compared directly with the physical evidence recovered from State Route 7. A later federal court record arising from civil litigation over Rainwater's death would state explicitly that she had been struck by a 1986 Chevrolet K10 pickup driven by Simon. On Tuesday morning, August 14th, 5 days after Rainwater was killed, investigators arrested Simon. According to the Washington State Patrol, Simon admitted during the investigation that he had fled after striking Rainwater. He was taken to the Pierce County Jail and booked for vehicular homicide and hit and run resulting in death. The arrest brought together several different forms of evidence and information: fragments recovered from the highway, public examination of photographs of those fragments, and an anonymous tip containing a license plate and a description of damage in the same area of the vehicle from which investigators believed the debris had originated. In announcing the arrest, the Washington State Patrol specifically thanked members of the community for providing the tips and leads that had assisted investigators. More details about Simon's account emerged when the criminal case entered court. At his arraignment in Pierce County Superior Court on August 15th, prosecutors charged him with vehicular homicide, failure to remain at an accident resulting in death, and unlawful possession of a controlled substance. Authorities identified the controlled substance as heroin. A not guilty plea was entered at that stage, and Simon was ordered held in the Pierce County Jail with bail set at $750,000. According to information presented after his arrest, Simon told investigators that he had fallen asleep while driving. That statement was his explanation for how the truck left the roadway. The established physical sequence was that the northbound vehicle moved onto the shoulder and struck Rainwater from behind before leaving the scene. The case continued through the Pierce County court system over the following months. On January 30th, 2019, Simon pleaded guilty to charges arising from Rainwater's death and the subsequent investigation, including vehicular homicide, hit and run, and drug possession. He received a sentence of 53.5 months under Washington's drug offender sentencing alternative. The arrangement divided the sentence between incarceration and community supervision, while requiring substance abuse treatment. By that point, the question that had confronted investigators on the morning Rainwater was found beside State Route 7 had been resolved. The vehicle responsible was the 1986 Chevrolet K10, driven by Simon. Rainwater's death later also became the subject of civil litigation. Her husband, Alan Rainwater, acting as the personal representative of her estate, brought a wrongful death action involving Simon and other parties. Years later, a federal insurance dispute connected to that litigation produced a court order that preserved several of the central facts of the original case. The United States District Court for the Western District of Washington recorded that on August 9, 2018, Susan Rainwater was riding her bicycle on State Route 7 in Eatonville when she was struck by a 1986 Chevrolet K10 pickup driven by Jeremy Simon and died at the scene. The role of the internet in identifying the vehicle remained one of the unusual features of the investigation. The Washington State Patrol's own account documented that the photograph of the broken vehicle parts received more than 600 Reddit comments, and that a commenter identifying himself as a Maryland State Vehicle Inspector narrowed the fragment to a mid-1980s Chevrolet truck headlamp bezel. At the same time, the official account makes a distinction between that crowdsourced identification and the lead that directly located Simon. The anonymous tip received by the Pierce County Sheriff's Office supplied the license plate and described a pickup with damage to its right side headlight assembly, and investigators stated that this tip led them to Simon's location and arrest. The sequence therefore began with physical evidence small enough to have been left scattered on the highway. Investigators recognized the fragments as likely pieces of a headlight assembly, but initially lacked the exact vehicle identification needed to turn them into a specific lead. Once photographs were circulated online, people with specialized automotive knowledge were able to compare their shape with vehicle components and narrow them to a Chevrolet pickup from the correct period. The anonymous report then supplied something the fragments alone could not provide: a license plate attached to a local pickup with corresponding front-end damage. Investigators followed that information to Simon and the 1986 Chevrolet K10, and Simon subsequently admitted that he had left the scene after striking Rainwater. 5 days after the collision on State Route 7, the driver and vehicle connected to Susan Rainwater's death had been identified, and Simon was in custody. For nearly 12 years, anyone examining the right satellite image of a residential neighborhood in Wellington, Florida, could have seen something unusual beneath the surface of a retention pond. Near the edge of the water was the recognizable outline of a vehicle. According to the Charlie Project, the car had been plainly visible in Google Earth imagery dating back to 2007, yet no connection was made between that object and a disappearance that had remained unresolved since the 1990s. It was not until 2019 that someone finally looked closely enough, leading investigators to William Earl Moldt, a Florida man who had been missing for 22 years. William Earl Moldt was 40 years old when he disappeared from Lantana, Florida, on November 7, 1997. Moldt, who worked as a mortgage broker, had gone to a nightclub that evening. Information recorded by the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System and later cited by news organizations stated that he was not a frequent drinker, although he had several drinks while at the club. At approximately 9:30 that night, Moldt telephoned his girlfriend and told her that he would be home soon. It was the last known contact she had with him. Moldt remained at the nightclub for roughly another hour and a half. At approximately 11 o'clock, he left the establishment alone. According to the NamUs information cited in reports about the case, he did not appear intoxicated when he departed. He drove away in his white 1994 Saturn SL, but he never arrived home. When Moldt failed to return, he was reported missing on November 8th. The disappearance presented investigators with an immediate problem. Not only was Moldt gone, but so was the vehicle he had been driving. Without the car, authorities had no physical scene that could establish where his journey had ended. The investigation failed to determine what happened after Moldt left the nightclub. Years passed without the discovery of either him or the Saturn. The case remained unresolved as the area around Wellington continued to change. Approximately 20 miles from Lantana, the Grand Isles residential development was being built around the time Moldt disappeared. One of its retention ponds already existed in 1997, even though the surrounding subdivision was still under construction. That pond would eventually become the location where the missing person investigation ended more than 2 decades later. For much of that time, nothing visible from the surrounding homes drew attention to what was beneath the water. The car was close enough to the pond's edge to become identifiable from above, but people living nearby did not recognize that a vehicle was submerged there. Aerial imagery eventually recorded what could not readily be seen from ground level: the Charlie Project, which maintained a profile of Moldt using information including NamUs and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, later reported that a vehicle was plainly visible in a Google Earth satellite image of the area from 2007. This meant that evidence pointing toward Moldt's location had appeared in publicly accessible imagery approximately 10 years after he disappeared and roughly 12 years before his remains were recovered. The image did not itself identify the vehicle or connect it to Moldt. That required someone to notice the shape in the pond and investigate further. In August of 2019, a previous resident of the Grand Isles neighborhood was examining the area on Google Earth. While looking at the pond, the former resident noticed what appeared to be a submerged car. Rather than leaving the observation unresolved, the person contacted someone currently living near the pond and told him what had been seen in the satellite imagery. The current resident then used a personal drone to examine the water from above. From that perspective, The observation could be checked independently of the Google Earth image. The drone confirmed the presence of a white vehicle beneath the surface near the edge of the pond. On August 28th, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office received a call reporting the discovery. Deputies responded at approximately 6:30 in the evening to the 3700 block of Moon Bay Circle in Wellington and inspected the retention pond behind the residence. The deputies confirmed that a vehicle was underwater. According to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, its exterior was heavily calcified, and it had apparently been submerged for a significant amount of time. Authorities removed the vehicle from the pond, and the discovery immediately changed the nature of the investigation. Human skeletal remains were found inside. Detectives and crime scene investigators responded, and both the vehicle and the remains were taken to the medical examiner's office for further examination and identification. The location and condition of the vehicle provided a possible connection to a missing person case from 22 years earlier. Investigators eventually established that the remains were those of William Earl Moldt. The identification was publicly reported in September of 2019, closing the central question that had persisted since November of 1997. Moldt had not simply disappeared without leaving a trace. He and his vehicle had remained underwater in a Wellington retention pond, while the surrounding residential community developed around the site. The vehicle recovered from the pond was the white 1994 Saturn SL, associated with Moldt's disappearance. Its discovery also explained why conventional searches had failed to locate the most important piece of physical evidence in the case. From the night Moldt left the nightclub, the vehicle had been missing along with him. Once it was located, the remains inside provided investigators with the evidence needed to resolve his identity and whereabouts. What the discovery did not establish publicly was the precise sequence of events that caused the Saturn to enter the pond. That distinction is important because several details from Moldt's final evening could otherwise suggest explanations that were never confirmed. Nameless information stated that Moldt had consumed several drinks but was not a frequent drinker, and reports also noted that he did not appear intoxicated when he left the nightclub. Authorities did not establish publicly that alcohol caused the vehicle to leave the road, nor did they provide a definitive reconstruction showing exactly when, where, or why the Saturn entered the water. Reports following the discovery continued to describe the circumstances by which the vehicle became submerged as unclear. The available evidence therefore establishes Moldt's movements before his disappearance and the location where he was eventually found, but it does not establish a verified cause for the vehicle entering the pond. The physical setting had also changed substantially during the years that separated the disappearance from the discovery. Grand Isles was still under construction when Moldt vanished, although the retention pond itself was already present. By the time the car was found, established homes stood around the water. The vehicle remained submerged behind residences occupied by people who had no apparent reason to associate the pond with a missing person investigation from 1997. Even a resident whose property backed onto the pond had not recognized from the shoreline that a car was there. The decisive observation came from above. Google Earth did not identify Moldt, analyze the old missing person report, or automatically alert investigators to a submerged vehicle. Instead, its imagery preserved a visible clue that could be recognized by a human observer. After the former resident noticed the shape, the personal drone supplied a closer aerial view, and the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office then carried out the recovery and investigation. The sequence was therefore a combination of publicly available aerial imagery, an individual noticing an abnormal object, a second visual confirmation, and conventional law enforcement work. The timeline also shows how long that visual clue had existed without being connected to the case. Moldt disappeared in November of 1997. According to the Charlie Project, the vehicle could be seen in Google Earth imagery from 2007. It remained unnoticed as evidence in Moldt's disappearance until August of 2019. On August 28th, the observation was reported to authorities, and the vehicle was recovered from the pond. Human skeletal remains were discovered inside, and in September those remains were positively identified as William Earl Moldt. 22 years after Moldt called his girlfriend and said he would soon return home, investigators were finally able to establish where he had been. The evidence recovered in Wellington resolved his status as a missing person, but it did not answer every question surrounding his final journey. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office confirmed the location of the vehicle and the remains, while the available reporting left the circumstances that placed the Saturn in the retention pond undetermined. What could be established was the route by which the case was finally resolved. A submerged vehicle visible in years-old aerial imagery was noticed on Google Earth, confirmed with a drone, reported to authorities, recovered from the water, and ultimately connected to William Earl Moldt. Jun Lin had moved from Wuhan, China, to Montreal in the summer of 2011 with a straightforward goal: to earn a degree in computer science at Concordia University and build a new future in Canada. Friends described him as hard-working, polite, and dedicated to his studies. By the spring of 2012, he had settled into student life, balancing classes with part-time work while maintaining close contact with family and friends. Nothing in his routine suggested that his name would soon become known around the world as the victim in one of Canada's most notorious homicide investigations. At the same time, another man living in Montreal had spent years pursuing public attention through increasingly bizarre behavior. Born Eric Clinton Newman, before legally changing his name to Luca Rocco Magnotta, he had attempted careers in modeling, adult entertainment, and reality television, while cultivating an online persona centered on fame. Long before the homicide, he had already attracted international attention after posting videos showing acts of cruelty toward animals, prompting internet users from several countries to work together in an unsuccessful effort to identify and locate him before his behavior escalated. During the evening of May 24, 2012, surveillance cameras recorded Jun Lin entering Magnotta's apartment building in Montreal. The footage became the last confirmed recording of Lin alive. Investigators later determined that he was killed inside the apartment during the night. Evidence collected at the scene, together with forensic examination and later court proceedings, established that Magnotta intentionally carried out the killing before attempting to conceal and dispose of the remains. Rather than trying to hide every aspect of the crime, he also created a video depicting the homicide and later uploaded an edited version online under the title "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick." The recording quickly spread across internet forums before authorities and website operators attempted to remove it. Reports submitted by individuals who had viewed the video initially failed to convince law enforcement that the recording showed a genuine homicide, delaying the realization that a real victim had been killed. While Jun Lin's friends became increasingly concerned after they could no longer contact him, events in Montreal rapidly transformed into a major criminal investigation. On May 29th, a building janitor discovered a suitcase containing human remains among garbage left outside the apartment complex where Magnotta had lived. Police officers searching the residence found blood evidence, personal documents identifying Magnotta as the tenant, and additional forensic material linking the apartment directly to the homicide. Around the same time, Lin's disappearance was officially reported after friends realized he had failed to appear for work and had suddenly stopped communicating. DNA testing later confirmed that the recovered remains belonged to Jun Lin. As investigators expanded their search, additional human remains were recovered over the following weeks, with the final major discovery occurring after information led police to Aundria Park in Montreal on July 1st. Forensic examination confirmed several days later that the recovered remains also belonged to Lin, allowing investigators to account for the victim with scientific certainty. The investigation became even more extraordinary because portions of the victim's remains had been mailed through Canada's postal system. Packages were sent to the headquarters of federal political parties in Ottawa, while additional parcels were later delivered to 2 schools in Vancouver. These discoveries immediately expanded the investigation beyond Quebec, requiring cooperation among municipal police services, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada Post inspectors, forensic specialists, and federal authorities. Every recovered package became an additional source of physical evidence, helping investigators reconstruct the sequence of events following the homicide. The mailing of obscene material also resulted in separate criminal charges beyond the homicide itself, reflecting that prosecutors viewed each action after the killing as an independent criminal offense supported by its own evidence. By the time investigators identified Magnotta as their primary suspect, he had already left Canada. Records established that he departed Montreal on May 26th and flew to Paris before traveling across Europe. Canadian authorities issued a nationwide warrant, while Interpol circulated a red notice requesting assistance from international police agencies. The extensive media coverage surrounding both the homicide and the international search meant Magnotta's photograph appeared on newspaper front pages and television broadcasts throughout Europe. On June 4, 2012, the search ended in Berlin, when employees at an internet cafe recognized him after he reportedly spent time reading news stories about the investigation involving himself. German police arrested him without any prolonged confrontation. He was later extradited to Canada aboard a Canadian military aircraft on June 18th to face prosecution in Montreal. The criminal proceedings that followed became one of Canada's most closely watched murder trials. Throughout the trial, the defense did not dispute that Magnotta had caused Jun Lin's death. Instead, the central legal question focused on criminal responsibility. Defense lawyers argued that mental illness prevented him from being held criminally responsible at the time of the offense. Prosecutors presented a different interpretation, arguing that numerous actions before and after the homicide demonstrated planning, organization, and awareness of wrongdoing. Evidence introduced during the proceedings included surveillance footage, forensic examinations, travel records, internet activity, witness testimony from Canada and Europe, DNA evidence recovered throughout the investigation, and expert psychiatric evaluations. The prosecution emphasized that the sequence of events, from recording the homicide, distributing the video, mailing packages, purchasing airline tickets, and fleeing across international borders, demonstrated deliberate decision-making rather than an inability to appreciate the consequences of his actions. After hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses over several weeks, the jury retired to deliberate. On December 23, 2014, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Magnotta was convicted of first-degree murder in the killing of Jun Lin, along with committing an indignity to a human body, publishing obscene material, mailing obscene and indecent material, and criminally harassing the Prime Minister of Canada and members of Parliament through the packages that had been sent. The court imposed the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder, life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Additional sentences were also imposed for the remaining convictions in accordance with Canadian criminal law. Following the verdict, the case formally concluded in court, although it continued to receive international attention because of its unusual combination of digital evidence, international flight, forensic investigation, and online behavior preceding the homicide. The Jun Lin case also became a landmark example of how online conduct can intersect with major criminal investigations. Years before the homicide, Magnotta's videos depicting animal cruelty had already drawn the attention of online communities that attempted to identify him and repeatedly warned that his behavior could escalate. Although those efforts did not prevent the later homicide, investigators eventually examined that earlier online activity as part of the broader history leading up to the crime. The investigation further demonstrated the importance of surveillance footage, international police cooperation, forensic DNA analysis, postal evidence, digital records, and coordinated intelligence sharing across multiple countries. More than a decade later, the murder of Jun Lin remains one of the most extensively documented criminal cases in Canadian history, remembered not only because of the international manhunt that ended in Berlin, but also because it illustrated how evidence collected from physical crime scenes, digital platforms, transportation records, and international law enforcement partnerships could be combined to reconstruct an extraordinarily complex homicide from beginning to end. Abraham Lee Shakespeare was living in Central Florida and earning money through labor-intensive and temporary jobs when a lottery ticket transformed his financial circumstances almost overnight. In November 2006, while working with a delivery truck that stopped at a convenience store in Frostproof, Florida, Shakespeare bought Florida Lotto tickets. One of them matched the winning numbers for a jackpot worth $30 million. He chose the lump sum option, worth approximately $16.9 million before taxes, leaving him with roughly $11 million after taxes. For a man who had previously supported himself through jobs that included unloading trucks, washing dishes, and other manual work, the change was immediate. But the public knowledge of his winnings also meant that people increasingly approached him for financial help. Shakespeare gave money away, paid expenses for people he knew, and made loans that were not always repaid. By the time the events leading to his disappearance began, a substantial portion of the fortune was already gone. Money had created disputes almost from the beginning. Michael Ford, a co-worker who had been with Shakespeare around the time the winning ticket was purchased, sued him and claimed that Shakespeare had taken the ticket from his wallet. Shakespeare maintained that he had bought the ticket himself, and a jury ultimately rejected Ford's claim. Although Shakespeare retained his winnings, the lawsuit was only one example of the financial conflicts surrounding him. Friends and acquaintances continued asking for assistance, while others owed him large amounts of money. Shakespeare later expressed frustration with the attention the lottery had brought him, and said he wanted the ordinary life he had known before strangers and acquaintances regularly approached him for money. In late 2008, Doris Donegan Moore, commonly known as Dee Dee Moore, entered Shakespeare's life. According to prosecutors, Moore initially approached him by claiming that she wanted to write a book about his life and about the people who had taken advantage of him after his lottery win. Their relationship soon expanded beyond the proposed book. Moore became involved in Shakespeare's financial affairs and eventually gained control over his remaining assets. At her murder trial, prosecutors said those assets included property, debts owed to Shakespeare by other people, and an annuity worth approximately $1.5 million. Prosecutors also alleged that Moore transferred Shakespeare's money into accounts under her control and created a company in his name while restricting his access to money associated with it. The state would later argue that these financial transactions provided an important part of the motive and chronology behind what happened next. Shakespeare disappeared in April 2009, but his disappearance was not reported to authorities until November, approximately 7 months later. The delay initially complicated the investigation because Shakespeare had previously complained about the constant demands placed on him after winning the lottery, making voluntary disappearance one possibility investigators had to consider. Yet there was no direct confirmation from Shakespeare that he had deliberately left. As investigators examined his finances and interviewed people around him, attention increasingly turned toward Moore. Authorities also discovered that activity attributed to Shakespeare had continued after he vanished. Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd later said that Moore still possessed Shakespeare's mobile phone and had used it to send messages to his friends while pretending the messages came from him. Prosecutors later presented additional evidence that they said showed efforts to create the appearance that Shakespeare remained alive. Moore was accused of offering a house worth approximately $200,000 to someone in exchange for falsely reporting that Shakespeare had been seen. $5,000 in cash was sent to Shakespeare's son for his birthday, and investigators said messages continued to be sent from Shakespeare's phone. During the trial, jurors also heard about a letter that prosecutors alleged Moore had arranged to make appear as though Shakespeare had written it. The state argued that these actions were designed to explain his prolonged absence and prevent relatives and acquaintances from recognizing that something had happened to him. Shakespeare's mother, Elizabeth Walker, testified about explanations Moore had given regarding her son's whereabouts, while investigators continued examining the increasingly inconsistent accounts surrounding his disappearance. The investigation eventually moved beyond financial records and interviews. Greg Smith, who knew Shakespeare and later cooperated with law enforcement, became involved in efforts to gather evidence against Moore. Investigators also used an undercover officer who posed as someone willing to accept responsibility for Shakespeare's killing. Audio recordings produced during this phase of the investigation were later played for the jury. Authorities said Moore disclosed information that had not been publicly released, including knowledge that Shakespeare had been shot. Investigators had not publicly announced that detail when Moore referred to it. According to Sheriff Judd, the investigation also established that Shakespeare had been killed around the 6th or 7th of April 2009. Another piece of evidence presented at trial came from surveillance footage recorded at a Walmart. Prosecutors said the video showed Moore making a cash purchase of items including gloves, duct tape, and plastic sheeting. Detectives later found items associated with that purchase near the location where Shakespeare's remains were discovered. The prosecution incorporated the footage into a broader circumstantial case that also included financial records, witness testimony, recorded conversations, and evidence concerning attempts to make Shakespeare appear alive after April. By January 2010, the investigation had led authorities to a rural property in Plant City, Florida, connected to Shar Krasniqi, Moore's boyfriend. Investigators spent days searching the wooded property and brought in heavy equipment to break through a large concrete slab. On January 28th, human remains were discovered approximately 5 feet beneath the concrete. The following day, authorities confirmed through fingerprints that the remains belonged to Abraham Shakespeare. He had been missing for approximately 9 months. Investigators determined that he had been shot twice in the chest with a .38 caliber firearm. What had begun as a delayed missing person investigation was now a homicide case, with a body, a known cause of death, and a developing chain of financial and circumstantial evidence. Moore denied killing Shakespeare. Before her murder trial, she publicly maintained that she had handled his money properly and rejected the allegation that she had shot him. Her defense attorney, Byron Heilman, emphasized that there were no eyewitnesses who could testify that Moore had fired the fatal shots, and argued that the evidence connecting her directly to the shooting was circumstantial. The defense also pointed to the fact that other people owed Shakespeare significant amounts of money. During opening statements, Heilman presented an alternative account in which drug dealers had killed Shakespeare and Moore had subsequently become involved in efforts concerning his assets. The prosecution rejected that explanation and argued that the financial evidence and Moore's actions before and after Shakespeare disappeared established a different sequence of events. Assistant State Attorney Jay Pruner told jurors that Moore had gained Shakespeare's trust, taken control of the assets he still possessed, and ultimately killed him after the financial relationship deteriorated. Rather than relying on a single piece of evidence, prosecutors constructed their case from the movement of Shakespeare's money, Moore's control of his property and debts, witness statements, surveillance footage, communications sent after Shakespeare disappeared, and recordings obtained during the investigation. The state argued that the efforts to make Shakespeare appear alive were part of a continuing attempt to conceal his death. Moore's trial took place in Tampa in late 2012. She chose not to testify. Jurors heard the competing explanations of the prosecution and defense and reviewed the evidence accumulated during the investigation. After deliberating for slightly more than 3 hours, the jury returned its verdict on December 10, 2012. Doris Dee Moore was found guilty of first-degree murder in the killing of Abraham Shakespeare. Judge Emmett Battles imposed the mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Moore also received an additional mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years for the use of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The conviction legally resolved a case that had begun with Shakespeare's unexplained absence more than 3 years earlier, after investigators followed the financial transactions, communications, witness accounts, and physical evidence that connected his disappearance to the property where his body was eventually recovered. Aundria Michelle Bowman was 14 years old when she disappeared from her home near Hamilton, Michigan, on March 11, 1989. Her adoptive parents, Dennis and Brenda Bowman, reported that she had run away, and the disappearance remained unresolved for more than 3 decades. There was no confirmed evidence that Aundria had established a new life elsewhere, and reported sightings failed to provide investigators with a definitive answer. What began as the disappearance of a teenager would remain an open case until an investigation into a completely different killing, committed hundreds of miles away and nearly a decade before Aundria vanished, brought investigators back to Dennis Bowman. Aundria had been born Alexis and was adopted as a young child by Dennis and Brenda Bowman. By the time she reached her teenage years, serious problems existed inside the Bowman household. Before her disappearance, Aundria had disclosed that Dennis had sexually abused her, an allegation later discussed publicly by Allegan County prosecutor Myrene Koch during Dennis Bowman's sentencing. Dennis denied the allegation at the time. His own history, however, already included serious criminal conduct. In 1980, he had been convicted in Michigan after attacking a young woman, and he later served years in prison. None of that provided investigators in 1989 with proof of what had happened to Aundria, and the case remained classified for years as that of a missing teenager. The investigation did not disappear with time. The Allegan County Sheriff's Office and Michigan State Police continued working on Aundria's case, but no discovery established where she was or whether she was alive. Her biological mother, Kathy Turkanian, did not even know her daughter was missing during the first 2 decades of the investigation. The adoption had separated them when Aundria was very young. In 2010, Turkanian learned that the daughter she had relinquished for adoption had disappeared as a teenager. She subsequently provided information and DNA as authorities continued searching for answers. Still, Aundria's whereabouts remained unknown. The major break came from Virginia. On September 11, 1980, 25-year-old Kathleen O'Brien Doyle had been found murdered in her home in Norfolk. Doyle was the wife of a United States Navy pilot who was away at the time. The homicide remained unsolved for decades, but advances in forensic investigation eventually allowed authorities to revisit evidence from the case. Investigators linked Dennis Bowman to Doyle's killing, and in November 2019, he was arrested in Michigan in connection with the Virginia homicide. The development was immediately significant to investigators who had continued searching for Aundria. Detectives from Allegan County and the Michigan State Police worked alongside Norfolk investigators and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service as the cases began to intersect. While Dennis Bowman was being investigated for Doyle's murder, authorities continued pressing for information about his adopted daughter. The renewed investigation finally produced information that had been missing for more than 30 years. Dennis disclosed his involvement in Aundria's death and provided information about where her remains had been concealed. Investigators were directed back toward property associated with the Bowman family in Monterey Township, Michigan. Instead of searching for a 14-year-old who might have left home in 1989, police were now searching for physical evidence that she had never left the property alive. On February 4, 2020, law enforcement officers searched property in the 3200 block of 136th Avenue in Monterey Township. They uncovered skeletal human remains in a shallow grave. Early reports stated that the remains had been found beneath concrete, but authorities initially stopped short of declaring that they belonged to Aundria. Identification required forensic testing. DNA analysis subsequently confirmed that the remains were hers. More than 30 years after she had been reported as a runaway, investigators had finally established where Aundria had been. She had been buried on property connected to the man who had reported her missing. The discovery transformed the investigation. On May 15, 2020, the Allegan County Prosecutor's Office announced criminal charges against Dennis Lee Bowman for Aundria's death. The original charges were open murder, felony murder, first-degree child abuse, and mutilation of a body. These were the charges filed at that stage of the prosecution. They were not the offenses on which the case ultimately ended. Investigators now had Aundria's remains, forensic identification, and statements from Dennis connecting him to both her death and the location where her body had been concealed. Dennis gave an account in which he said that he and Aundria had been involved in a confrontation at their home and that he struck her, causing her to fall down a staircase and die. He then concealed her death rather than contacting authorities. The prosecution's case also established that her body had been dismembered before the remains were buried. Dennis maintained elements of his own account about how the fatal injury occurred, but there was no trial in which a jury was required to determine every disputed detail because the Michigan case was eventually resolved through a plea. What was no longer disputed for purposes of the criminal proceedings was that Dennis was responsible for Aundria's death and had hidden her remains while allowing her disappearance to remain unresolved for decades. At the same time, the Virginia prosecution was also moving forward. Dennis pleaded guilty in connection with Kathleen Doyle's 1980 murder. The Virginia case established that Doyle had been sexually assaulted and killed inside her Norfolk home. Dennis received life sentences there, ensuring that even before the Michigan case reached its final sentencing stage, he was already facing imprisonment for the remainder of his life. The Virginia investigation had therefore accomplished something beyond solving Doyle's homicide. It had created the circumstances that finally broke open the investigation into Aundria's disappearance. In December 2021, Dennis Bowman pleaded no contest in Michigan to second-degree murder in Aundria's death. A no-contest plea does not operate as a conventional admission of guilt, but it permits the court to treat the defendant as guilty for conviction and sentencing. The resolution also meant that the original collection of charges filed in 2020 should not be confused with the final conviction. Dennis was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder, rather than being tried on the initial open murder and felony murder charges. On February 7, 2022, Dennis Bowman appeared in Allegan County Circuit Court for sentencing. Judge Margaret Zuzik-Bacher imposed a prison term of 35 to 50 years for Aundria's murder. Prosecutor Myrene Koch addressed the history of the case and Aundria's earlier disclosure of sexual abuse during the proceeding. The Michigan sentence was added to the punishment Dennis was already serving in Virginia. Because of the life sentences imposed there, arrangements were made for him to return to Virginia to continue serving his incarceration. The sentencing closed the central criminal case surrounding a disappearance that had begun on March 11, 1989. For more than 30 years, the official question had been where Aundria Bowman had gone after supposedly leaving home. The decisive evidence ultimately showed that the premise behind that question was false. Her remains had been concealed on property associated with her adoptive father, and Dennis Bowman had maintained the runaway account, while her case remained open. The breakthrough arrived only after investigators solving Kathleen Doyle's 1980 murder identified Dennis as their suspect, and authorities in Michigan used that development to pursue the unanswered questions surrounding Aundria. The February 2020 recovery of her remains provided the physical confirmation that the missing person investigation had lacked, and the subsequent prosecution ended with Dennis Bowman's second-degree murder conviction and sentence of 35 to 50 years.